Joe Mullings from 160 Studios, and I've got an educational session for you today, what I believe is to be the underpinning of the future of medtech, especially on the surgical side of things. We're going to be talking about the simulation part of the business that's growing very rapidly, and I think is critical to the success of all platforms on the surgery side. So joining me in studio, Elliot, thanks for joining me.
Pleasure.
Vijay from Seattle.
That's right.
All right.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. And Federico, you're joining us from very cool Italy.
Yeah, from Milan. Thanks
from Milan.
To having me.
Even he levels it up a little bit, not just Italy, Milan. Well, gentlemen, thanks for joining me in the session today. I want to start out with each of you, gentlemen, giving me your company and how you look at the simulation world. And give me the Reader's Digest version. And I'm going to be able to dive in deep. And for our viewers, we're all going to create an awareness around your platforms, which is really important. But I want the industry to understand how they should be looking at simulation moving forward. So Federico, I'll start with you. UpSurge and the focus in the area of sim that you specialize in.
Yeah, we started with microsurgeries. So I'm a neurosurgeon. This is my background. So in 2017, we started working on hybrid simulation using the best from physical simulation and the best from virtual simulation, merging things and creating a pathway with mental training and manual training, joining together all these resources. And the goal is to accelerate the learning curves as any other simulation, but with a specific focus on creating a curriculum, collecting data from performances, and the large vision in the future is using this data to certify abilities, which is something that all the companies on this panel are trying to do. I mean, creating an environment where we are able to objectively certify skills in surgery.
Vijay?
I'm Vijay Paul. I'm an emergency medicine doc, but also co-founder of Vantari VR. So Vantari is a virtual reality software platform that helps doctors, nurses, students practice procedures in VR in a safe, scalable environment before doing them on real patients. You could think about it as a flight simulator for healthcare. And the general view of simulation that we have is, well, there's a lot of things that healthcare has borrowed from aviation that, has been critical to improvements in quality management. But overall, how we think about things is in saving people's lives. And the notion of bringing across simulation and actually having a repeatable, measurable environment where clinicians can actually skill up and be game ready is critical. And therefore, the concept of flight simulation is actually very appropriate to apply in the medical context. And being a clinician myself, and one of my other co-founders, also a clinician, we are, very keen and acutely aware of the industry needs around that in terms of simulation training.
And I want to come back to the aviation and simulation analogy because I think that's really important, and it's going to tie into one of the things Federico said. So Elliot, Inovus, and where do you fit into that simulation world, and how do you view it from your purview?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And I think I'll give a very quick, brief sort of 30,000-foot view of who Inovus are, what we do, and then if it's okay, I'd like to dive into a little bit more about how we view the industry and the problems all three companies are solving. So Inovus is a surgical training technology business. Like the guys, I'm an MD by training, now full-time CEO, have been for a while. And our mission statement as a business is to become the world's partner for surgical training. That does not mean that we're saying the two businesses on this call, on this discussion today, shouldn't be there, because our job is to partner with all of the various elements that are going to deliver the paradigm shift that we must see in the way we deliver surgical training. Vijay's mentioned it there. He's talked about flight simulators. There was a paradigm shift in the aviation industry towards simulation first. That happened many years ago. We haven't seen that paradigm shift in surgical training yet. And that means that at the moment, we are currently using an antiquated approach to training surgeons globally. And if I may, I'd touch on where that's leading to us as a problem. And it's a problem statement that all three businesses are looking to solve. So globally, right now, every year we are not doing 143 million surgical procedures that require our surgeons to operate. Now, that is leading each year to 1.5 million preventable deaths a year, which, when we think about how many people there are on the planet, doesn't sound like a particularly big number, right? But that's the equivalent number of deaths, or preventable deaths, that are being caused by TB, multi-drug resistant TB, malaria, HIV, and complications from pregnancy combined. So we're in a little bit of a global health crisis when it comes to surgical care. And why is that? It's because we simply don't have enough fully qualified or trained surgeons to meet that growing demand in the modern day. And how have we got there? It's because we have still this relatively antiquated approach to training our surgeons, which is the see one, do one, teach one approach, where the majority of their learning curves at the patient bedside. And so all three companies that are talking today are looking at that and saying, well, how do we shift that paradigm away from the patient bedside into the simulated environment so that we have also a simulation first approach to training surgeons like we do with the airline industry. At Inovus, we take a hybrid approach, very similar to UpSurgeOn and Federico, where we place natural haptics at the core. So we put soft tissue models at the core of our simulators. We allow surgeons to operate on those with the instruments they'd use in the OR, and then we digitalize those soft tissues to deliver a level of immersion. So that's the problem we're all solving. I think as the conversation unfolds today with the others, it's also important to level set as to where do the different technologies solve the different parts of the solution to that problem. And that comes down to the surgical training pathway. And if I may, and then I'll hand over to the guys to say, well, Elliot, this is where we fit on this pathway. The way we think about the surgical training pathway as physicians at Inovus is, first of all, from a cognitive perspective. When we first start thinking about simulation, everyone thinks about physical simulation, diving into hands-on training. But from a cognitive perspective, that's where we should be starting. So this is pre-procedural cognitive training. So how do I diagnose the problem? How do I position the patient? How do I prep the patient? How do I consent them? Then we have procedural cognitive training. So this is, what are the steps of this procedure that I'm doing? This was traditionally learned by textbooks or standing at the patient bedside. And only once we've got that dialed in should we be thinking about physical procedural training, which is where everyone's minds first go to. And we can further break that down into a continuum, right? So we start with basic day one skills, part proxies. We then move into part procedure training, then full procedure training, and then what we describe as near real, which a lot of people use cadavers for. And certainly ourselves at Inovus and UpSurgeOn are looking at saying, can we solve that whole pathway, including the cadaver element, in a simulated and synthetics environment? Because there's various limitations when it comes to cadavers. The final point is the one that both of them have made, which is all the way through that continuum, we should be collecting data, providing feedback loops to that data, and ultimately getting to a point where we've built data sets so that we can use machine learning, or AI, which is the big buzzword, to augment and improve the surgical training continuum through co-pilots and AI-generated feedback loops to highlight where the biggest training needs are. So that's how we think about it, and hopefully that serves as a good foundation for the rest of it.
It's a good foundation to kick us off, for sure. So Vijay, you had mentioned aviation flight simulation. And certainly on a commercial pilot, they've got to go through requalifying on a regular basis, and that takes place in simulators. Some of that's for economics, some of it's for safety, some of it is for data, right, and really assessing it. So clearly a proven sort of modality. However, most of the surgeons I've ever chatted with do not want to be graded based upon their existing skill set, because there's not necessarily a agreed upon hardcore procedural pathway. If you have one procedure, and Gary Guthart said this, if I took somebody and asked them to do a lap chole, 100 surgeons, it would be done 100 different ways. So how do you think about that from that aviation analogy and then your platform?
I mean, that's a really good question. And I think one of the key elements is, as physicians, we have to be really honest with ourselves when we answer that question. And the individual nuances of doing a procedure obviously are different based on, say, patient anatomy or, body habitus or any of their pre-existing conditions. So it does pose an individualized challenge at any given time. But beyond that, I mean, that is, you step up to the plate, you do the operation, and that happens dynamically, or you might have gained some knowledge through pre-surgical imaging. But beyond that, there really is actually best practice guidelines about doing a procedure. And there is a step 1 to 50 of putting in a chest drain or doing a lap chole or, thoracotomy or any of these things. But surgeons have gotten into this habit, or physicians more broadly who do bedside procedures have gotten into this habit of saying and thinking that, this is how I was trained and this is how my mentor taught me, and that is the way it should be. And I think that's a real trap. And, we're all guilty of doing it, really. And the whole standardization across procedures is a thing that needs to get done and should be done, because there are best practice guidelines, there's evidence-based medicine, and there are ways in which that procedure, and Ben Elliott talked about the cognitive procedure checklist component, can be standardized for everyone. So that's how we think about it. And that conversation has to be more honest in the medical community. And if you have that honest communication, then you can say, actually, we agree that you can do it a standardized fashion. Now, if I give you a simple example, doing a surgical airway, you can do a horizontal incision or a vertical incision, and there are a couple of different approaches, and that then has the inherent variability down a flowchart mechanism. But that's okay, because if you did either approach, then that particular procedure will have its own checklist and it will have its own best practice guidelines on how to do it, step 1 to 50. So really, that paradigm has to come from this buy-in from the medical fraternity saying, actually, we're okay to do that. And after we say we can do that, then the question then comes back to, well, it's not to say that you're being marked or, this is a punitive measure. It's more that, don't you want to be sharp all the time? And do you not want to have actually critically important feedback on your technique so that you can improve over time? And the last thing that we don't really talk about is skill decay. And skill decay is a very real thing, even in short periods of time. And it really depends on your individual caseload. So as an ER doc, for example, if I give a very simple example, I see a patient today where that patient needed a chest drain, I would do the chest drain procedure. But if it took me another 2 years to see a patient who needed a chest drain, I will basically have skill decay. But we do expect the physicians to be at peak proficiency 2 years down the track if another patient was to present with needing that actual bedside procedure. Or in a surgical component, if you have general variability as a trauma surgeon, if you did one thing today, that might not be the patient case 2 years down the road. And what are you doing there? So that is a really important component. So if you look at it from the perspective of, are we changing our thinking process around accepting that there is going to be best practice guidelines, and that is a thinking shift that we have to make, and appreciate that skill decay is a real thing, then I think we'll be really on the road to actually embracing the paradigm shift that is the simulation.
Federico, one of the things that caught my eye when I originally came upon UpSurge was the fidelity of the models that you create. I mean, they're confoundingly world-class to me. I believe you might have a Hollywood special effects person on staff. I wouldn't be surprised. So what was the driver behind that on adoption, ongoing utilization, and the value that adds versus other platforms and modalities in the market?
Thank you, John, for this question. Yes, the point of realism is one of the most important elements in our simulation, and the goal is to create an environment where the trainee can experience all the emotional impact deriving from the reality. So even managing a complication inside the environment is absolutely critical for the learning. So the realism is not just nice to have. In our opinion, in our view, is the most important element, because I need to have the sensation of being there. And if I want to impact on a learning curve, and I want to have an additional procedure in my learning curve, I need to have the perception that that simulation was not a simulation, was a real case. And this is the way to reduce the distance between that experience and the patient that I will meet in the OR. So that's why we try to target the realism as one of the most important elements.
There's some interesting stats out there, and each of you gentlemen, I'd like your opinion on them. So you're looking at a marketplace in medtech that's been staked at about, over the next 9 years, about a 15% CAGR, compound annual growth, going from 1.85 billion to 6.82 billion. Now that might not feel like a lot when J&J is dropping 13 million on Shockwave and 16 million on Abiomed, but it's a baseline of a category that's still underappreciated, because there's data out there that says 1 in 10 patients who get into the healthcare continuum get harmed during a procedure, and 50% of those could be preventable based on training. So with this unbelievable robust market around us, we aren't seeing that investment, adoption, and utilization of it. So Federico, I'll come back to you on your perspective on high growth. Why isn't the money following it? Patient at risk. More people will die on a table than in an airplane accident on an annualized basis. So how come they're not connecting the dots there?
It's important what you said, and you mentioned many aspects of the problems. The point is, in my opinion, that first of all, it's not just about a new market or a new wave. This is a cultural change, so it's lower by definition. And when we talk about simulation, traditionally, what people think about simulation is, I mean, the phantom for the RCP or basic procedures. But when we come to surgery, no one imagined today that you can use a simulation to do a real procedure, a surgical procedure. So there is still resistance in accepting that you can do that. And if you start understanding that you can do that, you can also understand that you can collect data from that. And you can start having evidences on the literature, and you start having an impact on real patients. So when these things will be much evident in terms also of scientific evidences on the literature, in my opinion, the wave will be stronger in terms of justifying an investment on simulation, because these will have an impact on costs for complications, costs for education, and so why today hospitals generally don't invest on training, don't invest on simulation-based training. The reason is because it's not so clear today that these can improve the patient outcomes. So in my opinion, all the company involved in simulation are creating evidences. And I think we should target the revolution, not starting from the old generations. You said an important point, Joe. There is resistance in the adoption of simulation, or there is a resistance in accepting that simulation can unveil my limits. And we shouldn't start from that generation, those generations. We should start from the new generations, saying that you will be faster, you will learn faster, you will have less stress. And if you take the residents from the same school of residency and exactly the same school at the end of the cycle, they will be completely different one from another, because they had different chances, different mentors, different days, different opportunities. And this is not acceptable anymore. When we finish residency, we have an autonomy of 20, 30% on the procedures, and this is absolutely not acceptable. If we start from them, and if we start from patients, the revolution would be easier. So it's a matter of cultural change, in my opinion.
Yeah. Elliot, I want to go to you. According to a report from the Institute of Medicine, 60 to 90% of preventable deaths from medical errors were avoided due to the use of simulation-based programs. That's a pretty substantial stat. And in an industry where insurance works on nothing but stats, the heck of feelings, why still the resistance there?
Yeah, that's a really powerful figure, right? And I want to just go back to the TAM, the total addressable market first, if that's okay, because I think that feeds into the answer here. So that reported TAM of sort of 1.9 billion with a 15% compound annual growth. At Inovus, we actually feel that's not representative of the marketplace. That's representative of the old guard marketplace. And what do we mean by that? Why have we not had the paradigm shift towards simulation? Where is the resistance, or why hasn't it happened? Traditional simulation-based technologies have self-limited the market. They're traditionally these large mainframe and people call it virtual reality-based technologies, which are very expensive, they're difficult to access, very hard to scale, and they're not, from a haptics perspective, so field feedback, realistic enough for our surgical colleagues to say, I'm going to adopt that to replace the stuff I'm doing at the patient bedside. So that's been a major sort of bottleneck towards the adoption. That's also meant that that's self-limited the total addressable market, because those technologies, when they are being sold and they are used, they're sold as a nice to have within the training pathway, not a must have. And they're sold in mainframe style. So think about the mainframe computing of the 60s and 70s. So when we're actually thinking about the total addressable market at Inovus, we don't view it like that. We view it, and along with our colleagues like Federico and Vijay, that we're actually market makers. And when you extrapolate out this market, instead of looking at it from a mainframe technologies perspective, you say, actually, can we put technology that's more affordable, more accessible, and more realistic, like Federico's incredible soft tissue models, in the hands of every surgeon? And then every surgeon has to engage with that. What does that market size look like? That's a $12.9 billion a year market. So it's our responsibility as the leaders in the space to articulate that, because when we articulate that, and by the way, that's a very conservative number, because that's only actually looking at $3,000 per surgeon on the globe per year training spend. That's how we got to $12.96 billion a year. So now we're looking at a much larger market. Now we can start engaging people that look at that and say, well, I can invest more heavily in that market. That now allows technologies to improve, and it allows organizations like ourselves to increase the evidence base to say that 60% of preventable deaths that could be solved by simulation-based training or training, here are technologies showing that happening. So I know we're working on it, I know Federico and Vijay are working on it, which is growing that evidence base to take to the financiers to say, this will save you operational cost within your organization. And so that's one approach to selling it, instead of the traditional cost plus buy our mainframe technology and put it in a simulation center. But the only way that those cost savings will occur and those preventable deaths will be reduced is if you put it in the hands of every single surgeon, not just one or two now and then.
Vijay, so you've got this VR, safe to call it VR, right? It's more of a VR versus an AR environment that you're training in.
That's right.
And yours, out of the two modalities, feels like it takes into more of the landscape of the theater of surgery. I got a chance to experience it. I think we were at TCT when I got a chance to experience it. I come from a training background, but more combat sports, as well as sort of special ops training, where you take in the full theater, and that influences the hormonal dump on you, and therefore your fine motor skills. Where Elliot and Federico are taking a little bit more at first of a micro look and then stepping out, but still affecting that hormonal dump that happens during a moment that you didn't expect to happen. And hence the critical reason for simulation. If you're going to put a patient at risk, you can't do that. Therefore, you never get that experience. So how do you in the organization process that full theater look and then bring me down into the actual micro surgical side of things?
Sure. From the zoomed out perspective, contextualization is important. And as Federico mentioned earlier, immersion is important. And immersion, and really good immersion, is actually part of the training process. So how much do you believe that you're in an operating theater environment when you put on a headset and step into the Vantari platform? And now, is it only the operating theater environment? Because we have the flexibility and now the freedom to actually put you in any environment. So let's talk about some of the settings that you talked about there. How about for military combat training, military medic training, actually? So, how do you do the TC3 model, basically TAC evac and care under fire and putting in battlefield medicine type of procedures? You can suddenly create a totally immersive environment that's maybe on the battlefield. You can do it at the back of the ambulance. You could do it in an emergency bay. So when we think about it from a zoomed out perspective, we think about our environment is really important because it's contextualizing what it is that you're going to learn in that session. So whatever that looks like in terms of the procedure you're about to learn. Now, once you're in there, you're completely immersed in the environment. Then we present you with a patient who's, a digital representation who's anatomically accurate, so that you are, when you're interacting with the patient and doing the procedure or the surgery, it actually reacts the virtual patient like you would expect the virtual patient to. They're hooked up to the monitor, which is all virtual. There can be changes in vital signs and other things. If you make a mistake, there could be a complication that arises, bleeding, person crashes, etc. And then we have the instrumentation, which is what we call a digital functional twin of real world medical instrumentation. So not only do we care that it looks like what you use in real life, but it behaves like what you use in real life. So it has physics. It's physically modeled, mathematically modeled, so that there's gravity. You pick up a tube, you can actually bend it, and it has bend physics. So it's completely physically modeled instrumentation that then goes to interact with your patient. So once you're immersed, you're zoomed out and like, okay, I'm totally believing that I'm in this environment, I'm doing this procedure. You go into the nuances and actually doing step-by-step the procedure itself. You pick up everything, you feel so natural. You interact with the patient, things you expect to happen. And the greatest thing, if I give you a couple of examples that, anecdotally we see, it really works. And obviously there's a lot of data now with studies to support this, is when they finish I think, Joe, you might have done this too. When someone finishes a session, they go to put down the controllers on the trolley in the VR environment. And in the real world, it's empty space. So we've had lots of demos where people have actually dropped the controllers on the floor. So, you go, actually, please put on the wrist clasp because we've broken probably about 10 controllers. So that's like a really anecdotal example. The second part is you do it and you don't say anything because you get out and go, oh, wow, I just did a surgical airway. Oh, wow, I did this procedure. And you don't say anything about any of the steps because, when you do say something is when you think that it was broken and you notice something that was broken about the simulation. But if you don't say anything and get out and go, oh, okay, I actually did this start to finish, then you're actually saying, well, that was a believable simulation for me. And I truly did that procedure. And I feel a lot more confident and prepared. So attaching to that, Joe, if I may, some of the data, like, from the previous conversation that we were discussing, what does the data look like? Well, that is really, as leaders in this space, for us to create the data and put it out there. And there is a massive growing body of VR in medicine evidence base now. And we are the type of companies that are now putting out that data, actually publishing in journals. And that is actually leading to the acceleration of adoption. I would say that. And the last thing to say is, when you ask about, we talk about how amazing it is, the fidelity of the soft tissue models Federico's working on, and how the immersion looks like. A point that I want to ask in this forum is, how many of you here have thought that we did some of it to ourselves? And what I mean by that is, there have been bad players in VR who've actually, gone out to the market promising a lot and not delivering. And essentially, there's lots in the industry, either on the institutional side or, say, a medical device side, who've seen a lot of bad VR. And they think that's all that is possible because that's what they've seen. And they've seen the limitation of the technology. Because as an industry, we've done bad things to ourselves by promising too much and not delivering on that promise. And we have, in a way, been trying to fight against that early wave that actually, went out to the market and didn't really deliver. And now we have to change people's thinking or perception of what is possible and what does good simulation look like. So I'm really interested to know how you guys feel about this in this forum, because we've definitely experienced that as a company.
Yeah, Federico, I want to go to you and answer that question that Vijay had. I have one other question because it plays into something you said earlier. I know as a trainer, and again, I've been a trainer with special ops people and also with fighters, that behavior gets changed when you introduce consequences. So there have been great fighters that I've had, and in camp, they're amazing. In the cage, they're amazing. On the mat, they're amazing. But the second there's 15,000 people sitting in Vegas and they step in, they get a, let's just say they get uptight. And your model, I think it's a sphincter contraction, but your model, you mentioned, introduces consequences from a high fidelity perspective. So you've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about that, and as a surgeon, you felt it.
Yeah, I think that the consequence is fundamentally an information that you need to prevent and you need to preview also virtually. I mean, we try to merge the physical with the virtual. And in my opinion, virtual and physical, just to connect to the VJ observations, I think they need to be integrated somehow, because there are limitations on both sides and the only way is to integrate them. But in my opinion, there are different moments. I use the virtual to preview a situation and information. I can create an automatism. I can understand a sequence, an automatism on understanding which instruments. Let's remember that there are surgeries that use a lot of instruments. For example, spine surgery, orthopedics is another skill, is another knowledge. I don't study how to use the instruments, and I need to learn that. It's not medicine, let's say. It's the technology to perform the surgery. So I need to understand in a very automatic way, in a very safe way, in a very quick way, how to use the technology. So this is the business side with MedTech. And this is why this is going to be a booming market, thanks to this to this aspect. I mean, simulation can provide the possibility for MedTech to showcase an incredibly complex technology during a congress. People operating with an ultrasound aspirator, removing a tumor without gloves, with a nice tie during a congress. I mean, this is the revolution that we have seen. And in my opinion, when you remove the tumor and in that moment you have the bleeding because you did something wrong, that consequence that you mentioned, you have an impact. I've seen people saying, reactions, emotional reactions. They were, for one moment, they forgot that was a simulation and they reacted. And you see that reaction and say, was this automatic reaction a good reaction or a bad reaction? How did you change your behavior in that moment? So what I think is, I've seen masters teaching about the brain aneurysm clipping. And one day, one of these masters showed a video, a very impressive video of a clipping and suddenly the rupture of the aneurysm. So everything disappeared under the blood. And even a very experienced surgeon was like, very scared and paralyzed. Of course, you need to understand how to manage that. I wouldn't be the patient on that case if that was your first experience. I did my first brain tumor resection on a young lady, and she didn't know this. So this is how it works. So the consequence is not only on the patient, it is also on myself. When there is a consequence, when there is an error that I know that I could avoid. So what happened, not only to the patient, but what happened to you as a surgeon? So the consequence is emotional. And for sure, this stress brings you to avoid the error the next time. So in my opinion, the consequence is important. So the failure, the error are the key of the simulation. I need to do that. I need to break the aneurysm. Otherwise, I don't understand. I mean, if I experience the complication, I know in my mind what is the worst scenario possible. So my fear is more controlled. I know what is the worst case. I mean, what is the worst situation after my choices? If I know that, I can have a better attitude, a better behavior. And this is possible also with virtual. I believe that virtual alone is not enough. Physical alone is not enough. There are two different kinds of emotional impacts that we need to create.
Got it. All right, I'm going to go around the horn here for last question from everybody. So this is obviously a very large market, high growth market, low R&D risk, low clinical risk, no FDA risk at this moment in time. Perhaps that might be changing in the next couple of years. Why hasn't, forget about venture capital. Venture capital does not invest in this category, nor if it's outside of a heavy clinical regulatory lift. But private equity, this is a private equity dream. You've got three different modalities here that are complementary of each other. They all overlap each other in a constructive way. Why has private equity not jumped in here and made a modest acquisition, rolled these up and taken this to market, created the market, and then dominated the market? So love your insight into that. This is not on any of your prep, but I'm sure you all think about this. Federico's rubbing his chin thinking about it right now.
I'll take one for the team and go first.
Go ahead. And then I want VJ and then I want Federico, because you're all businessmen. You're all really smart people. You're surgeons and MDs, for God's sake. There's a ton of money on the table here. What is PE not seeing here?
Well, thanks, Joe. Thanks for tabling that question. And the first thing I'm going to say is I think they're starting to see it. So let's look at it all comes back to the history of the industry that we're in. So traditionally speaking, we have trained surgeons at the patient bedside not using simulation. There have been market entrants coming in and allowing us to build that market over the years. And that market is now starting to mature. So like any marketplace, the early innovators have pushed on. You can use robotics as an example of this. Look at the amount of capital flowing into robotics, but it took 25, 30 years before that's really started to flow. And I think we're starting to see that unlock now for surgical training technologies and surgical simulation. And so why hasn't it happened before? I think people have been trying to understand what are the right technologies and how are we solving this problem. And I think we're now starting to see various businesses and innovators really articulate that problem. I also don't think it's been a big enough problem for people to want to go and solve. But look at the numbers we're talking about now. We're having the same number of preventable deaths globally every year as 4 of the 5 most talked about conditions on the planet, where in the last 20 years, $60 billion worth of capital has flown in to solve 3 of them. So that's now starting to resonate with PE. What else is starting to resonate with them? Well, now we're starting to see some businesses that are solving the problem in a way that has intrinsic value to the end user, which really importantly, to your point, means our end users are buying our products, which means we're creating businesses that are profitable businesses, which takes us out of that category of VC, because it's a bit confusing for them, and into the category of PE. And that's really, really powerful for anyone that's trying to push this market forward and actually build that $12.96 billion a year market, because we do require those market-making capabilities. And a lot of that comes from PE, where they can have a really, really deep thesis and say, right, we have got a significant amount of capital to start rolling together some of these technologies, because it comes all the way back to the point that VJ was making and that Federico was making, which is we have all these different types of technologies. There isn't a one size that fits all for that pathway we spoke about. Very quickly, if it's okay, when we think about the technologies you can use to deliver surgical simulation, which by the way, we're only talking about the simulation part of the pathway. There's still training that has to go on in the live OR, and that's a different story, because then that suddenly starts cross-pollinating into digital surgery, into the strategics that Federico was talking about, and all of a sudden now, when PE look at that, they go, that's really exciting. But if we're just thinking about simulation, you've got mainframe virtual reality, big bits of kit, headset virtual reality, like what VJ and his team do. You've got analog technologies, basic box trainers, cadavers, and then you have hybrids, which bring soft tissues and digital environments together, like ourselves and UpSurgeOn. So now, if you look at that, you have to say, if I am going to go and build the business that's taking the majority share of a $12.96 billion industry, I am not going to be able to do it just with headset VR, or just with mainframe VR, or just with hybrid technology. I need to make sure that we're going for a problem-first solution, and which technologies will solve the different bits of the problem, i.e. the different bits of that pathway. Which bits are perfectly suited to cognitive training, which bits are perfectly suited to hands-on physical training, and then within that, which parts of the technology continuum are perfectly suited to each part of that hands-on training. And when someone goes ahead and looks at that, that's where they start getting interested. And I think because we're doing a much better job of articulating it now, PE is starting to come into the space.
I would agree with that. Vijay, what's your thoughts on that category? There's lots of dry powder on the sidelines. The three of you gentlemen, by the way, you each signed, I get 5% of your deal when this goes down. What's your perspective on that?
100% something like this is going to happen in the next 2 years, 100%. And what I would say is probably Federico and Elliot, and myself included, won't be publicly talking about it, but certainly having private conversations about what an M&A transaction looks like with a lot of other leaders right at the moment. So I'm personally sort of aware of at least 5 conversations going on, not just including Vantari. So really, there was once upon a time over the last 5 to 6 years that we raised capital to grow. And us being founders now of well-defined platforms that are now in the market and expanding are now thinking about raising capital to acquire or actually facilitate a merger conversation. And it's a no-brainer, right? At the end of the day, as we're thinking, it's a spectrum and lots of different pieces put together nicely from a strategic perspective to make X or Y platform even more powerful because it adds something and it's a nice bolt-on or adds something to your core offering. So certainly we're going to see a lot of that. The really great example, actually, historically, when we think about simulation, was CAE Healthcare. It's been in the news over the last few months, but CAE was the #1 flight simulator company in the world, but 10 years ago decided that they wanted to add CAE Healthcare and go into healthcare simulation. They bought up 5 companies and rolled it all up and created CAE Healthcare. Now, obviously, they divested that started this year, but that was a play that was made in simulation about 10 years ago. No doubt at all that that's happening coming for us right at the moment. And it could be basically kicked off by one of us too. So that would be really interesting to see.
Agreed. And Federico, I'll finish up with you. This sets up like a dream. It's a cash flow business. It's a platform build. It's international in nature. And it's probably a incredibly high growth market. We just need really good operators to step in. So your thoughts on it?
Thank you, Joe. I think there are several reasons for what you said. I mean, why this is not happening so explosively. In my opinion, the first reason is that when we talk about aviation, there is just one aviation. If we talk about surgery, there are many, many disciplines. And when, for example, I refer to the incredible work that Elliot and Vijay are doing in different disciplines. So when we talk about, for example, Elliot, I know the incredible work that Inovus is doing and a great follower. I need to say is in a specific field, in a few specific fields. And if Elliot, we have conversations with Elliot. I would love to ask to Elliot, do you know the name of the most famous neurosurgeon in the world? I am a neurosurgeon. And Elliot doesn't know because, are 2 different universes. We are, let's say, alien coming from different planets. So from the point of view, the standpoint of an investor, there's not one simulation. There are different fields, different disciplines. And this is the first difficulty. They don't get the vision of the entire perspective and the entire, let's say, opportunity, if you want. So what we're trying to do, what Elliot is trying to do, what Vijay is trying to do, we are trying to create not just the procedure, but the methodology to scale up procedures and disciplines. And of course, we need investors, as you said, with a great vision. And the other thing, probably, we have in common another point, I guess. When we started with UpSurgeOn, we started doing business in a specific field called surgical simulation. As Elliot said, we are market creators because this doesn't exist. But then we realized that was not that biggest market. I mean, the 6 billion in the statistics is changing because now we are realizing that data from simulation are a much bigger market. So we are talking about $1 trillion market from talking about the data. And this is another difficulty for investors. How much it costs? What is the value of this data? We have no idea. It's like Google in the first period saying, we have these people navigating, we are not getting enough revenues from this because we don't know how to use this data. Then they started relating the data with the habits of people. And this is the point. One of the questions of investors is, okay, this data, fantastic, I understood. But who is going to pay for this data? And this is, again, the cultural change that we said. So in my opinion, we need to understand the value. And the value here is not easy because we're saying how much it costs not treat the complication as we have done in the last 50 years. And so this life of people on the table, probably the most important point is we need to quantify how much it costs not to deal with to manage the risk and the costs in a different way. But experimenting this concept is not easy. So just to conclude, we need investors with vision and brave enough to be the first. I mean, this is, as you said, there will be sooner or later someone with this idea, with enough money in the pocket to say, acquisition, and dominating a future market. But we need people with vision. And it's not easy, not even for surgeons, to understand this. Imagine for investors that many times are not surgeons. So there are many, many difficult challenges for investors. And of course, for us, that we need to convince them. It's even more difficult, I would say.
Well, let's hope this is the seed that does that. I know all my PE people will be watching this and getting their own copy of this as well. Well, gentlemen, I appreciate your time. I appreciate your patience on this. Elliot, thanks for joining us in-house.
Thanks for having me.
Vijay, thank you so much for creating the time. Federico, yourself, and
Thank you so much.
Continued success to all of you. I'm Joe Mullings from 160 Studios. Be well.